This video is going to be about how one would transition from using the typical Source 1 hammer to the new Source 2 hammer. This might be the first video in a series of videos. I would like to cover materials and models for Source 2 as well. Half-Life Alyx is coming out in 5 days, so this is all subject to change because I believe there's going to be newer versions of the tools. But, you know, I don't know. So before I get into all this, I'm going to show you how to launch Source 2 Hammer, even if you don't have VR. So what you do, it's very simple. You launch SteamVR, even if you don't have a VR headset hooked up. And what you're, I have to explain something. What I'm doing here is I'm VNC'd into my VR computer, and this I haven't ran Hammer at all on it before. My current computer, which is what you're seeing around this window, I have set up Source 2 Hammer already, and I want you to see what it looks like on the initial launch so I can explain a few things with coming from old Hammer to new Hammer. So I've actually been somewhat using the Source 2 tools since like 2016. Back then, I don't know if you could use the SteamVR tools. I think you used a thing called Destinations, and I tried using that, and you can actually see, look at this, look, 2016 Destinations. It was the last time I launched those workshop tools. But I mostly messed around with the Dota 2 tools, and I ported a couple like stupid maps I made to Source 2 just to see like how it works. And so the way you launch the tools is by right-clicking this menu here, going to Workshop, and hit Create/Modify an Environment. Now you'll be greeted with this menu, and there's some very helpful things here. Most importantly is this button that says View Wiki. This is probably going to be the most useful thing ever, specifically this page right here, SteamVR Workshop Tools Documentation. This is what you're going to want to look through. There's some really cool stuff in here. I haven't really looked through this yet. I have been using Dota 2 tool documentation for a while, and I didn't even know this existed until a little bit ago when I launched this and like noticed that button there. So definitely check this out. It's cool, and there's a lot of really neat information there. But what you're going to see is probably this with just a locked add-on that says SteamVR Home. So what you do is you hit Create Empty Add-on, and you think up a cool add-on name. So Cool 2. So if you have a headset hooked up, you can just hit Launch Tools. But if you don't have a headset hooked up, you hit Show Launch Command Line, copy all this, and then open Notepad or something, so you can easily edit and save this. And you want to remove the VR and Tools VR option because you will not be needing them. Other than that, you just copy that, and then you can either create a shortcut, or what I would just do is paste it into this and hit enter. And what this is doing is launching tools. So now you have this thing right here. This is kind of like your preview window if you had a VR headset hooked up, but you don't, so you can get rid of that. So this is your asset browser. This is what you're going to see now. And to get to Hammer, you just hit the Hammer button right here. And this is what you're going to see when you launch Hammer for the first time. And I'll go and create a new map, and you'll see that we've got 3 planes kind of going on here. So it's not going to look this goofy on your computer because you probably have a screen with a reasonable resolution. But the reason I wanted to do this on here was to show you what a default layout looks like. I use a layout that's a lot more akin to traditional Hammer. In fact, I might actually get rid of one of these 2D views because you really don't need all 3 with Source 2 Hammer, unlike normal Hammer where having all 3 views is very important because your 3D view is kind of not really a working view. You don't really do much work in 3D except texture assignments and things like that with old hammer. Well, new hammer, you can do pretty much everything in the 3D view, and you basically don't need the 2D view at all, but I still will like to have, you know, two of them. So what the heck is going on here? How do I make it look like yours? It's so crazy. So what I personally like to do, and this really sucks, and I think it could possibly be fixed in the future. Maybe the Half-Life Alyx version of these tools will make some changes, but I highly doubt it because, like I said, these tools have been around since 2016, earlier than that, really. But what I don't like is that you can see over here, this is normal hammer, and you see I have my selection mode, my textures, my new objects. These are in separate windows, and they're actually on my second monitor. So this is where my first monitor cuts off, and this is my second monitor you're seeing. Source 2, I have that kind of same thing set up. I have my VisGroups over here with old hammer. Well, I would also have my VisGroups over here, as well as my active material I'd have up here. And this is how I would actually use the Source 2 hammer editor. However, the problem comes when you close hammer and open it again. It doesn't seem to want to open these floating windows. Anyway, so how do you get it like that? Well, first things first is just to, you're going to want to start closing stuff. Object properties, there's no reason to have object properties be its own window that's constantly there, because object properties, much like in hammer, can be opened with Alt-Enter. Outliner, have no clue what that's for, so we close it. Undo history, pretty cool, but not needed. And now you're going to want to switch this. It'll say assets, you switch it to 2D side. And now it's kind of weird, so we're going to go up here to layout, and we're going to do 4 view quad. Set this to top, 2D top, side, front. So now that should be exactly how hammer's set up, is like this. You can move your active material away. I actually like keeping the tool properties over here, and you know, maybe I will put my active material down here as well, because the tool properties can, you rarely have large lists, although in face mode you certainly do have a lot of things. So now to the real meat of the video. What are the differences between working with old hammer and working with new hammer? And I will refer to the two now as hammer and hammer 2. So to start things off, the first thing that you need to know is the most important button in hammer 2, and that is F1. This is your command window. This will show you every available command in hammer, and you can search too, so tool, view. Some of these commands, a lot of them, don't even have hotkeys assigned to them. If you press this little keycap, it'll open a floating window, which you could put off to the side, and this shows every single bound command and its keyboard shortcut. You can also search too. Another very useful hotkey is Shift+G, and what Shift+G does is it repeats your last command. I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but I want you to know it now because in my opinion it's probably one of the most useful features of Hammer 2. In Hammer 2 you can change the grid size the exact same way you would do in Hammer 1 with the bracket keys. But in Hammer 2 the grid can go all the way down to 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. Now Half-Life Alyx may be completely different, but as far as I know, SteamVR uses 1 unit equals 1 inch. In normal hammer, 1 unit is 3/4 of an inch or 0.75 inches. And this can create some issues with importing maps from source 1 into source 2, because most maps in source 1 are built with walls that are 128 units or 8 feet high. That's the standard ceiling height in most of the world. Most hallways and things are 8 foot high. Now, if you import those exact 128 units into Hammer 2, it's going to treat each unit as an inch, meaning that 128 units is 10 foot 8 inches. But the player height is also scaled up. In Source 1, your player is 4.5 feet tall. Very small. In Source 2, you're as tall as you are in real life if you're wearing a VR headset, I assume. But the default character is still 72 units, which means you're 6 feet tall. So even though the dimensions are off, technically importing things may still be somewhat to scale relatively. It may or may not work, is what I'm trying to say. So in Hammer 2, almost everything can be done via the 3D viewport, unlike Hammer 1. But you can still do almost everything in the 2D viewports if you want. So let's start off by making a simple brush. We're going to hit Shift+B to open the block creation tool, and we're going to create a block. And you can see I did it in 3D, but you could also do it in 2D if you'd like. Now, one problem with Hammer 2 is it's missing a feature. Hammer 1, let's create a block, and let's give it a texture. So in Hammer, whenever you have a brush selected and you go to create a new brush, that new brush will maintain the same height as the previous brush. Hammer 2 does not have that functionality. Each brush you make has to be created completely from scratch. There's no references, and of course this could change in the future, but it probably won't. So there's 4 tools to interact with things in Hammer 2. You've got your selection tool, or Shift+S, just like in Hammer. This will allow you to pick between objects. And then you have scale, rotate, and translate, or ERT, respectively. That would be these 3 here. ERT, or scale, you could think of this as maybe expand, E, R, rotate, and T, translate. Now in any of these modes, you can actually use the numpad to enter specific values. So I'm going to make a new brush, for example. So now I'm going to go in the move mode, and I'm going to start by dragging it a little bit the direction I want. And now I'm going to type 10. And now it's moved that box 10 units from where it originally was. If I type 0 and hit enter, now it's back where it originally was. If I type 256, it'll move an entire block's worth. If I type 1000, it's going to move all the way over there. And again, 0 will reset it back to its position. So let's say I do want to move it 256 units that direction. I can type that in, and now I want to move it a different way. Well, now I can move it this direction, and it will change the origin point, so I can move it that way. It only goes back to where you were at the previous selection. So if I deselect this, and then reselect it, and move it this way, and I hit 0, it's not going to move it back to its original point. The other 2 modes work the exact same way. Scale mode, when you type in a value, it scales it by that multiplier. So 1 will reset it to 1, 2 will scale it by 2, 3 by 3, 4 by 4, and 1 will return it to where it was. And of course you can type in 0.5 to do half, or whatever you want. The rotation mode works exactly the same way. You can rotate it, or you can type in a number. So 45, now it's 45 degrees, 0, we'll return it to 0. So most of the time you're probably not going to use the numpad input because you don't really need it. It's all here with the gizmo itself. And all of these tools snap to the grid, as you can see. If I lowered the grid, I can get a little bit finer control over my translations and scaling. Rotation, however, is a little different. You have to change your snap angle down here at the bottom right. So as you know in Hammer, whenever you hold down Shift, drag, and release, it creates a copy of an object. If I Shift, drag, let go of Shift, and then release, it moves the object. It does not copy it. Hammer 2 is very similar. However, all you need to do is hold down Shift, then begin your drag, and you can actually let go of Shift. Now, every time you press Shift, it will create a duplicate, meaning you can create as many copies as you want without having to drag again. So I just mentioned about the snapping angle. So next to your angle snap degree selector, you have your other 4 snapping settings. You've got enable snapping, that would be Ctrl+W. You've got enable grid snapping, that's Ctrl+Shift+W. Then you've got enable vertex snapping, that's Ctrl+Shift+X. And then here you have enable angle snapping, and that doesn't have a hotkey as far as I know. Turning this off will disable your rotations from snapping to anything. However, during any movement in any of the types, holding down Control will disable snapping as well, just like in Hammer. So if I were to want to move this over and not have it be on the grid, and I'll make the grid a little larger to visualize this better. As you can see, it's snapping to the grid. Well, if I hold down Control, it will disable snapping altogether. And that works in all modes, rotation and scale. So now I'm going to talk about camera movement. In Hammer, you move the camera around in many different ways. Mostly WASD, A and D will pan the camera left and right, W and S will move the camera forward and back, or you can use scroll wheel to move it forward and back. The rotation of the camera or the panning of 2D views is typically done with the arrow keys. However, if you're using Gary's mod Hammer, you can use middle mouse to do these things. In Hammer 2, the WASD buttons are exactly the same, panning and moving in and out, same with scroll wheel. The main difference here is that you use right click to rotate your camera around or pan 2D views. You do not use left click or middle mouse. In Hammer, pressing Ctrl+Shift+E would center your object in 3D view. Pressing Ctrl+E would center it in 2D view. In Hammer 2, it's very similar, but acts a little different. Ctrl+Shift+E will center an object in all views. Ctrl+E will center an object in the 2D views only. There's also Shift+A, which will center your view only in the selected viewport of the selected object. So if I select down here, I hit Shift+A, it's only going to affect this viewport. Ctrl+Shift+A will, however, center it in all viewports in a different way. What it does, you'd think that this is exactly the same as Ctrl+Shift+E, but it's slightly different. You'll notice Ctrl+Shift+E zooms into the center, very close. Ctrl+Shift+A zooms in so you can see the entirety of the object. So it's pretty much the exact same thing, but with a little bit of different functionality. Just like in Hammer, pressing F2, F3, F4, and F5 changes your viewport mode. In Hammer, whenever you're in 2D and you press a number key, it's going to zoom to that zoom level, 0 through 9. This is really useful, but we don't have that functionality in Hammer 2. It's gone because 1 through 6 are used for our object selection mode, which I will talk about now. Object selection modes. Selecting objects in Hammer is done with your typical Windows style, holding down Control and left clicking, Control clicking on something already selected to deselect it. But in Hammer 2, this is no longer the case. Shift clicking will allow you to select multiple objects. Control clicking a selected object will remove it from that selection. There are two different keys now. In Hammer, you can use the left mouse to create a rectangular marquee that allows you to select multiple items at once. In Source 2, you can also do this, but you can do this even in 3D. Hammer 2 also has the middle mouse lasso tool, which allows you to select things in non-square marquees. Now typically in Hammer, when I work, I select by the center point. Selecting the edges does not allow me to do this. Hammer 2 is a little different, where by default it only selects things that are fully encompassed completely. Even if the center point is selected, it won't select it unless the whole thing is encompassed in the marquee. Now in Hammer, you can disable this toggle select by handles option, and this will allow you to select as long as it's intersecting the brush at all. You can get this exact functionality in Hammer 2 using the function toggle select intersecting. And how you do this, since there's no hotkey, you open the commands window and type toggle select. You see toggle select intersecting. Now anything my marquee touches will be selected. In Hammer, you have 3 selection modes: groups, objects, and solids. The groups mode will allow you to select grouped objects. So these 2 objects are grouped. So what I just did is create a brush entity so I can demonstrate the solids selection mode. Now solids will select only solid objects. It's the exact same thing as pressing ignore grouping. You'll see ignore grouping actually turns on when I go to solid selection mode. And in this mode, even if you drag an object that was part of an entity, it will not become an entity itself. As you can see, it is no longer an entity, but this is still a brush entity. Object mode will select entire brush entities even if they're part of a group. So I'm going to add this brush entity to this group, and now in group mode it selects all of them, but object mode will still individually select that entity. Hammer 2 works in the exact same way, except the solid selection mode is now called meshes. This is because meshes no longer need to be solid objects. Grouping also works the exact same way it does in Hammer. You simply select multiple objects and hit Ctrl+G to create a group. I'm in mesh mode, so it's not going to select that group. I have to be in group mode. To ungroup, it's the same. Ctrl+U, they're no longer in a group. Hiding objects works the exact same way as it does in Hammer. H to hide an object, U to unhide all, and Ctrl+H to hide all but selected. So in Hammer, the only way you could select an individual face of a brush is by using the material selector. In Hammer 2, there are 3 sub-object selection modes: vertices, edges, and faces. So vertice or vertex mode allows you to manipulate vertices, very similar to the vertex manipulation tool or Shift+V in Hammer, but you have significantly more features such as merging and beveling, things like that. The edge selection tool lets you select edges of an object and manipulate them. You can also select loops and rings and change normals and things like that. Face mode is probably the most important mode, and it's very similar to the material selection tool from old Hammer. It allows you to modify textures and change faces, delete faces, things like that. It also lets you create subdivisions, which are used for displacements. So there's a total of 6 different object selection modes, and they're split into 2 different categories. You've got objects and sub-objects. You can cycle through the 3 modes with spacebar really quickly, and you can cycle through the 2 categories with Shift spacebar. And you can hop back and forth very quickly with Shift spacebar. So in Hammer 2, there's also 2 different modifiers for selection modes. You have Boundry and Convert. Convert works pretty good with almost every mode. You could have an entire mesh selected, holding down Alt to set Convert mode, and you can click or you can press the number corresponding to the sub-object mode you want, and that will convert that selection to the selection of that mode. So in this example, I just took the entire mesh, I held down Alt and hit edges. You could also hold down Alt and hit 2 on your keyboard, and that will select all edges in that mesh. But this works well with other modes too, such as face mode. Say I had multiple faces selected, and I wanted to select all the edges of those faces. Well, Alt edges, now I have all of those edges selected. Boundary mode, which is Control, is a little different. So let's go back to face mode and select these 2 faces. Now if I use boundary mode by Ctrl-clicking on the edge mode, it's only going to select the edges that are around the faces that I had selected. Now there is one more way to select things in edge and face mode, and that's by double-clicking. So in edge mode, double-clicking an edge like this will try to select the entire edge, and double-clicking an edge like this will try to select a loop. Face mode's a little different, because in face mode, double-clicking simply selects all faces in the object. Face mode also has Alt double-click, What Alt+W does is it selects all faces in plane with your currently selected object. Face mode and edge mode have Shift+Click, and what this does is you have two objects selected and you double click and it will select all objects between those two selected objects. So in that situation I just selected those two other faces. Edge mode works the exact same way, like so. Now I'll talk about displacement creation. In good old Hammer, whenever you wanted to create a displacement, you would go and you'd select a face that you wanted to make, hit create, and create a power of X displacement. And what this does is it gets rid of the other 5 faces of your cube and leaves you with this one face that's a displacement. And then you can paint the geometry however you want in 3D. It's very similar in Hammer 2, but there are quite a few differences. So first you go into face mode and you select the object you want to become a displacement. And then you go down to subdivision. There's 5 levels of subdivision. Think of these as like your power in Hammer. And once a face is subdivided, you can use the displacement tool or Shift+D to go and paint a displacement on it. You can see it in the 2D view a little better. Here, I'll change the texture real quick to something a little bit easier to see. So here we have our displacement being created, and it's not limited to just flat planes anymore. You can have a displacement now on any face you want. You just subdivide the face, and you can go to the displacement tool and start painting the displacement. And it will actually not allow you to like make a messed up side like it is here. It normally doesn't let you do that. There seems to be like a auto sewing to edges of subdivisions that aren't subdivided, but in this situation it seems a little broken. But as you can see up here, it's still sewn with the non-subdivided faces mostly. And you may have noticed displacements don't need to be made on just squares anymore. You can make a displacement on anything, including cylinders. And it works with any face, including simple triangles. As you can see here, you can subdivide this and paint a displacement on it. This tool I just used here is the Polygon tool. It allows you to draw polygons out, and it's pretty useful, but it's a new feature, and I'm not going to cover new features too much in this video. Now there's this button in Hammer 2 called Bake Subdivision. Now what this does is it gets rid of the subdivision and it converts it to actual physical faces, which is not able to be edited by the displacement tool. And I'm not 100% sure about this, but from what I assume is that meshes that are subdivided are probably a lot easier to render than meshes that have had their subdivisions baked in. Now I'm going to quickly cover blend textures. In Hammer, blend textures were made with displacements only. You could only use blend textures on displacement to get their functionality. You could obviously apply a blend texture to a non-displacement, and you would get only one of the textures. But a displacement, you can paint the alpha to get the secondary blend texture that you want. Hammer 2 is very similar. So I've got these 3 faces and these have the blend texture applied to them. And if I go into the paint mode, it doesn't seem to be working. It does work, however. It just only works on a vertice level. And you can actually fill it completely if you want with that button. And to switch between what you're painting, you click the texture that you want. And there you go, that's how you do it. And this isn't a displacement, this isn't a subdivided mesh. As you can see, if I go in here, I'm at subdivision level 0. Now if I went up to subdivision level 5 and went back to paint, I would have a lot more control over my painting. See, painting does not need a displacement per se, it just needs vertices. So as long as you have vertices, you can paint a blend texture. So we're talking about textures now, let's completely talk about textures in general. In Hammer, texturing is done in a pretty simple way. You have your material selector, Left-clicking on any face will pick up that texture, and right-clicking on a face will apply that texture. You can also select a face and then Alt-right-click on another face to apply and then align the material relative to that first face you had selected. So you can do this. Now it's quite a lot different in Hammer 2. In Hammer 2, you can hold down Shift and right-click in any selection mode to pull whatever texture is under your mouse at that time. And this even works with models, as you can see. If you go into face mode, pressing Ctrl and right-click will apply the current texture to whatever face you right-click on. Pressing Alt and right-click works exactly how Hammer works, where it aligns the texture to the first face that you have selected. In Hammer, using Shift+T would apply your current material to the entire brush. You can do the exact same thing in Hammer 2 in Mesh mode. It will apply it to the entire brush. You can go to Face mode and select a face and then Shift+T to assign just that face the currently active material. This of course works if you, say, have multiple faces and you Shift+T. It will apply it, or it will crash Hammer 2. That'll happen also. I assume it just crashed because it was trying to apply a non-blend texture to something that had a blend already. So make sure you save often in Hammer 2. It's exactly the same as Hammer 1. It likes to crash for no apparent reason. So I still need to talk a little bit about texturing, but just real quick. In face mode, there's also a ton of different texture options you can do. Your typical shift, scale, rotate, like you have in Hammer, and then you have all these other buttons that allow you to do all sorts of things. And my favorite feature of Hammer 2 is the fast texture tool right here. This is super cool and lets you do a lot of really cool stuff. So now I'll talk a little bit more about advanced brush creation in Hammer. You have a brush and it's a solid object, all 6 sides. So let's use the clipping tool, Shift+X, and we'll cut it in half. Now if we separate these two halves, you can see now we have 2 objects. Both these objects are totally solid. Well, in Hammer 2, you go and you select a mesh and then use the clipping tool, Shift+X also, and as you can see, if I move this away, by default, it does not cap the sides. So sometimes this is what you want, and sometimes it isn't what you want. So I'm going to do this again, but you can select this box, Cap New Surfaces, and hit Enter, and now your surface will be capped just like old Hammer. So now I'm going to, let's say, select this brush, and I'm going to cut it in half, and I'm not going to cap the surfaces, and I only want one side. Now I'll go into Edge mode with this edge selected, and I can extrude and move this edge out. You can move this and manipulate it, you can scale it, do anything you want with it. You can extrude it some more, you can do anything you want. So now I'll go into Face mode, and I'm going to Shift+Drag that face out to extrude that face. Now let's say I liked this shape and I wanted to fill this. Well, I go back into Edge mode and I select this this open edge, and you'll notice there's these little kind of extra lines, and that signifies that it's not connecting to anything else. So to cap this, you just press P, and you can use that capping tool, P, to cap any shape as long as it has a full edge loop around it. So now I'm going to go into Face mode, and I have this face selected, and I'm going to hit C. Now what this is the cutting tool. This works with Edge or Face mode, and what it does is it allows you to cut an object however you want, really. You can go pretty crazy with this and make a lot of really interesting shapes. And now we have that. And if I wanted to extrude that, I could. You can also select a ring of edges and press V to add in a new edge loop. So I have this brush, and I'm going to rotate it off-grid to a really weird angle. And now let's say I want to take this face and extrude it out. Well, there's clearly a problem. The center of this face isn't on a grid point, and if I extrude it out, it's going to not be aligned with the other faces. There's a way to fix this in Hammer 2. You simply press Tab, and what this does is it changes your coordinate space from global, which is the grid, to local, which is relative to the currently selected face. So now I can just drag out, and it will be perfectly straight and relative to that face. Same with this face over here. Again, you can just press Tab to cycle between local and world space coordinates. Hammer 2 is a lot different than original Hammer because the grid isn't really an essential thing anymore. The grid is just there to help you do things. It's not something to hinder you anymore. Now the grid is just there as a reference and a guide, and I'll explain a little bit about that later. But for now, I'm going to talk about entities and models. So just like in old Hammer, Shift+E brings up your entity tool, and you can place entities down just by clicking, just like in Hammer 1. In Hammer 2, if you have any of these sub-object modes selected, you can't actually select an entity or a model. You have to be in mesh mode or object mode or group mode. All of these will allow you to select an entity. Alt+E, just like in Hammer, brings up the object properties, which will allow you to change different, properties of each object. You can also change this into something like a prop physics. Now this will be a physics prop with no model, of course. You can search for a model using this little magnifying glass button, and it brings up kind of like an asset browser type deal. Now one cool thing about Hammer 2 is that you can actually scale up props in the editor dynamically. In fact, you can even go so far as to change some physical attributes. You can make the whole thing a different color. So this stove is white. Well, we can change the FX color and recolor it. Now it's a red stove. Models can also be placed using the asset browser. This is probably the easiest way to place models, but you go to this model tab, and this shows you your whole list of models, and this allows you just to drag and drop directly into the map whatever you want. Now all of these props, they're going to be prop static by default. If you want these to be physics props, you have to go in and change them. So you can do, any transformation on models as well. You can obviously rotate them. You can scale them as I showed. But you can also use the physics simulation tool, which can be accessed with Shift+C. And I select an object and hit Start Simulation. I can actually drag an object around and, well, put it wherever I want. And it works with any object, even these. And I'll show you that this is still a static prop, but I can simulate it with physics to place it around the world in a more realistic fashion. Now I'm going to cover VisGroups. So to see your VisGroups, you go up to Tool Properties and you open your VisGroup window. Now these are auto VisGroups. VisGroups are a little bit different in Hammer. So in Hammer, you've got your VisGroups, you have user and auto. Auto are obviously automatically generated by the world. User are user-generated VisGroups where you can add things to a new VisGroup, like so. So now I have my own custom VisGroup that I can turn on and off. Well, Hammer 2 is very similar. However, user VisGroups are no longer part of auto VisGroups. It is a completely separate panel called selection sets. Selection sets are now your VisGroups. So let's say I wanted all of these props and this brush to be part of a selection set. Well, I can hit the selection set new button, remove from other set, hide from set. You can use either of these two options, but I'll just keep that. And now this is a selection set, and I can hide and show. I can use this button to select the entire group. And so that's how you use VisGroups in Hammer 2. So let's quickly look at the pivot tool. I don't want to talk about this too much because it's a more advanced thing in this video. I'm not trying to explain how, to use Hammer 2 or anything. I'm just explaining some very, basic differences between Hammer and Hammer 2. But the pivot tool is a new feature that allows you to do some really cool things, such as move the origin point of any object anywhere, and you can permanently affix the origin point there, or it's temporary most of the time. When I click off of that, it will reset itself. So what's the purpose of putting the origin point over here? Well, this is very similar to in old Hammer. If you made a set of objects or an object slightly off of the origin point and then imported that as its own instance into another map in order to create complex rotations, such as creating clipped spiral staircases. So in this situation, what I'm going to do is use the rotation tool, and I'm going to extrude out and then Shift+G, and look at this. You can quickly create extremely complex geometry and do a lot of unique stuff. Another new tool in Hammer 2 is the Asset Spray tool, and what this does is pretty much what it says. You can select a list of models and things, and it lets you spray these assets with whatever parameters you want in an area. So this will be really useful for creating clutter and things with small, garbage can objects and things like that, or this could be really useful for placing down like grass sprites and things to make a nature scene. And the last tool I'm going to talk about is the Path tool. Now, you can access the Path tool with Shift+P, and I'm not exactly sure the full functionality of this tool. It might not be fully implemented, or I might not understand it. But it seems like you can do a lot with this. This seems like this could be a way of creating ropes and things like that easily. However, from what I can gather, it's used for placing props along a path. However, the props, they don't seem like they really want to align very well with the path. They're always on this weird angle pointing inwards, and it's just very strange. So that's the main differences between Hammer and Hammer 2, and as well as some of the new features of Hammer 2 that are really cool. I hope this was helpful for you if you're a long-time Hammer user and you're just now, because of Half-Life Alyx, coming into using the Source 2 tools. And hopefully in the future I'll make a video about the Source 2 material system and modeling and things like that. But Hammer 2 is very cool, it's very different, and it certainly is, complicated and hard to grasp at first, but once you get used to it, you can make cool stuff like this. If anyone watching this can give me a better way to create, like, cuts into curved surfaces. So I have multiple faces along a curve, and I want to cut another curved object into that, or even just any object into that. There is no subtraction in Hammer 2. There's no Boolean operators. It's all just cutting faces. Can you hear that? It's raining. It's raining pretty hard right now. Cozy.